Playing soldier again, are we? You think wearing these flashy rags to court is going to make people forget what an ungrateful daughter you are? Walter's cold voice echoed off the courtroom walls. His thick finger poked hard against the Medal of Honor ribbon pinned to the left breast of my Navy uniform. Standing right next to him, my mother Elise hissed through her teeth. She was never a real part of this family. Do not even look at her. 14 years crawling through crossfire and dirt in the Middle East, and I never broke, never surrendered. Yet today the two people who brought me into this world were spitting on the very thing I traded my blood for, all to steal my grandfather's final legacy. I swallowed the metallic taste of betrayal, locking my shoulders into a rigid brace. But right at that moment, the presiding judge looked up from the bench. His hand gripped the wooden gavel, trembling slightly as he whispered a phrase that drained the color completely out of my parents' faces. Good Lord, is it really her? Before I tell you why the people sharing my blood ended up on their knees that afternoon, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel right now. Because the ruthless secret buried underneath this uniform is going to make you look twice at your own family. 3 days before the courtroom, dawn broke over the Oregon coast with a heavy wet fog. The air tasted of salt and rotting driftwood. Inside the house, the silence was absolute, right up until the squeal of rusted brake pads shattered it. Outside the front window, a white United States Postal Service truck idled by the mailbox. At my feet, Finn let out a sound. It was not a normal bark. It was a low guttural warning that vibrated deep inside his chest. Finn is a retired military working dog, a Belgian Malinois. He knows the difference between a friendly visitor and a threat. I opened the front door. The mail carrier did not smile. He handed me a thick, heavy envelope. It required a signature. I signed the electronic pad, took the package, and shut the door. The sour chemical stench of industrial glue hit my nose before I even ripped the cardboard tab. I pulled out a stack of crisp white legal papers. Clatsop County Circuit Court. Summons and complaint. Plaintiffs Walter Webb and Elise Webb. Defendant Alicia Webb. Cause of action. Willful abandonment of the family estate. Petition to terminate all legal inheritance rights. My eyes scanned the black ink. They were suing me. My own flesh and blood had gone to a judge to officially erase me from the family line and take the deed to the house. My heart rate did not spike. My hands did not shake. Muscle memory took over. Inhale for 4 seconds. Hold for 4 seconds. Exhale for 4 seconds. Hold for 4 seconds. The tactical breathing rhythm of a Navy SEAL operating under hostile fire. There were no tears. Crying is a luxury reserved for people who have someone left to catch them when they fall. I pressed my thumb hard against the raised red wax of the official court seal. I pressed until the skin over my knuckle turned completely bone white. The physical pressure was the only thing keeping the cold rage from boiling over into violence. I dropped the papers onto the wooden dining table. They landed with a flat, heavy smack. I walked straight into the kitchen. My combat boots made no sound on the floorboards. I pulled out the bottom drawer of the oak cabinet. Way in the back, hidden under a stack of old dish towels, was a heavy rubber band holding together 14 years of bank transfer receipts. 14 years. Every single month. I ran my calloused fingers over the faded printed numbers. This was my hazard pay. The extra money the military pays you for taking bullets in foreign deserts. While my squad mates were using their extra pay to buy trucks or save for college, I was wiring every single dime back to Clatsop County. I paid the exorbitant property taxes. I paid the roofers when the winter storms tore off the shingles. I kept the county tax assessor from foreclosing on this exact piece of property while my parents sat in their comfortable leather recliners complaining about how hard their lives were. They weaponized their own incompetence. They played the victims, draining my accounts while I bled in the sand. At the battlefield, my brothers in arms watched my back. Back home in America, my parents waited for me to turn my back so they could file a lawsuit and steal the ground out from under my boots. I gathered the receipts. The paper felt dry and dead against my skin. I walked over to my black Pelican hard case sitting on the floor. I spun the combination dials, popped the heavy latches open, and dropped the financial evidence inside. They wanted to play a legal game involving property rights and inheritance. They had no idea they were dealing with an operator who documented every single piece of ammunition and every single dollar. The metallic click of the briefcase lock echoed in the empty room. It sounded exactly like the heavy hammer of a pistol locking into place. The sound dragged me violently back into the past. 14 years ago. The morning I shipped out for military training. The air smelled of wet mud and cheap stale beer. Walter, my father, dragged my olive-drab duffel bag across the wooden porch and hurled it into the muddy front yard. The heavy canvas hit the dirt with a sickening thud. "You walk down that driveway, you are dead to me," he had screamed. The veins in his neck bulged, his face purple with alcohol and pure malice. "Selfish brat, you leave now, do not ever bother coming back." His rage had nothing to do with losing a daughter. It was entirely about losing a financial shield. The night before, I'd flatly refused to forge my signature on fraudulent bank loan documents to save his failing construction business. I refused to go to federal prison for his incompetence, so he threw me away like garbage. I snapped back to the present. The cold Oregon morning air chilled the sweat on the back of my neck. I reached into the side pocket of my tactical bag and pulled out a small green sniper logbook. The pages were weathered and rough. I grabbed a black ink pen. I flipped to a blank grid page. At the top, I wrote 2 words in capital letters: hostile targets. Right below that, I wrote 2 names: Walter Webb, Elise Webb. They were no longer family. They were active threats. Just as I capped the pen, the wall phone rang. The shrill electronic tone sliced through the dead silence of the kitchen. I picked up the receiver. "Webb!" "Alicia." It was Mary Land, the elderly widow who lived in the house next door. Her voice was thin, trembling with anxiety. "I know you just got back from your deployment, honey, but I think you need to go look out back." I gripped the plastic phone receiver. "What did you see, Mary?" "Yesterday," she whispered, her breath catching in the receiver. "When you drove into Portland for your medical checkup, I saw your father, Walter." My jaw locked. "Go on." He parked his Ford pickup truck a block away, walked through the back alley so nobody would see him from the street. He had a heavy iron crowbar in his hand, Alicia. He pried the security frame off the back window. I heard the wood splinter. Then he went straight down into your basement. He was down there for an hour. The basement. The only zone in the structure I kept heavily padlocked. The one place that held my grandfather's military footlocker. The phone line went dead. The defensive line was breached. It was time to hunt. I hung up the phone. The receiver clicked into the cradle with a hollow plastic snap. I did not run. Running creates noise. Noise gets you killed. I walked to the steel gun safe bolted inside the hallway closet. I punched in the 6-digit code. The heavy locking bolts retracted with a mechanical clunk. I pulled out my Glock 19. I dropped the magazine, racked the slide back to eject the live round in the chamber, and caught the brass casing in midair. Unloaded. Safe. I did not need bullets for a burglary that happened yesterday. I needed the high-lumen tactical flashlight mounted under the barrel. I pushed the basement door open. The stale, heavy smell of damp concrete and old motor oil hit me instantly. I hit the switch on the weapon light. A blinding white beam cut through the thick blackness, slicing across the wooden stairs. I moved down, slow, heel to toe, keeping my weight balanced over my hips to stop the old wood from creaking. The basement was a mess. Tools scattered, shelves knocked over. I swept the light across the far wall. The top shelf was empty. The heavy wooden footlocker that usually sat there was gone. Walter had taken it. He thought he had hit the jackpot. I lowered the muzzle of the Glock, dragging the beam of light across the cold concrete floor. That is when I saw it. Lying face up in the dirt was a framed photograph. The glass was shattered. It was a black and white picture of my grandfather Henry standing proudly in his Navy uniform. Right across his face, stamped into the broken glass, and the photographic paper was a massive dried mud print. A size 10 work boot. The deep, aggressive treads of a cheap hardware store work boot. Walter's boots. My chest tightened. A cold, hard knot formed in the pit of my stomach. My grandfather was the only person in this family who ever taught me about honor. He taught me how to throw a punch, how to change a tire, how to stand up straight when the world tried to beat you down. He died 14 years ago, right before I shipped out. And now his own son had stomped a muddy boot right across his face just to steal a wooden box, hoping to pawn off whatever was inside for a quick buck. The disrespect was not an accident. It was casual. It was trashy. It was exactly who Walter Webb was. I dropped to one knee. The cold dampness of the concrete soaked right through the fabric of my tactical pants. I picked up the broken frame. I wiped the dried mud off the glass with my thumb. I pointed the flashlight beam directly at the floor where the shelf used to be. The dust was disturbed, but the scratch marks on the concrete were shallow. Walter had moved fast, sloppy, driven by greed and panic. He grabbed the most obvious box in the room and ran. He was stupid. My grandfather was a Master Chief in the United States Navy. A Master Chief does not leave his most valuable intel sitting on a top shelf in plain sight. The wooden box was a decoy. I stood up. I swept the light to the darkest, tightest corner of the basement, right behind the rusted water heater. The space was covered in thick cobwebs. Nobody had touched it in a decade. I walked over. I crouched down and pressed my palm flat against the wooden floorboards built over the concrete foundation. I pushed. The third board from the wall had a slight, almost invisible give to it. I stood up and grabbed a heavy steel pry bar off the workbench. I wedged the flat iron lip right into the tight seam between the boards. I threw my body weight backward. The old wood shrieked. Rusty nails screamed as they were ripped violently out of the joists. The floorboard snapped upward. I shined the light into the dark cavity beneath the floor. There it was, a heavy rusted iron lockbox, covered in decades of dust. I reached down and hauled it up. The iron was freezing cold against my bare hands. I dropped it hard onto the workbench. The padlock was old. I did not bother looking for a key. I jammed the pry bar through the hasp and snapped the cheap brass lock in half with one vicious downward thrust. I threw the lid open. Inside, the smell of old paper and dried tobacco filled the air. Lying neatly on top was my grandfather's patched, faded navy jacket. Underneath it was a small, thick journal bound in cracked black leather. I opened the journal. The pages were yellowed. I flipped past old fishing logs, grocery lists, and weather reports from the 1980s. I flipped all the way to the very last page. It was entirely blank. No letters, no words, just faint pencil marks pressed hard into the paper. Dots and dashes. Morse code. If you have ever had a family member snoop through your private things or disrespect something that belonged to someone you loved, hit the like button right now. Drop a comment below and just type, "I know the feeling." Because right now I need to know I'm not the only one dealing with this kind of betrayal. I pulled the green Scout notebook and the black pen out of my pocket. I set them down right on the rusted lid of the iron box. I stared at the dots and dashes. 14 years in the military. I did not need a translation manual. My hand moved automatically, writing the letters down on the green grid paper as my eyes scanned the pencil marks. Dash dot dot dot. B dot 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 dot. H dot dot I. Dash dot N dash dot dot D. I kept writing. The scratching sound of the pen was the only noise in the basement. I finished the sequence. I looked down at the letters I had just written. B INDSHIPPIC behind ship pic, behind the ship picture. I snapped the green notebook shut. I killed the flashlight on the pistol. The basement went pitch black. I turned and looked straight up the dark wooden stairs leading to the living room. Hanging right above the brick fireplace on the main floor was a massive heavy oil painting of a wooden Navy ship riding out a storm. It had been hanging there since before I was born. Walter had torn apart the basement looking for a payoff. He had no idea the real secret was hanging right over his head the entire time. I took the wooden stairs 2 at a time. The muscles in my thighs burned, but my breathing stayed completely flat. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out. The floorboards in the living room groaned under my boots. I stopped right in front of the brick fireplace. Hanging above the mantel was the oil painting. A massive heavy piece of art showing a wooden Navy ship fighting through a violent storm. I reached up, gripped the thick oak frame with both hands, and yanked it off the wall. A thick cloud of gray dust drifted down. I flipped the painting over and laid it flat across the glass coffee table. The back of the frame was sealed with old brown cardboard. I reached down to my belt and pulled my tactical knife from its Kydex sheath. The steel blade was matte black, 3 inches long, and razor sharp. I pressed the tip into the top corner of the cardboard. I dragged the blade straight down. The dry paper ripped with a harsh tearing sound. It sounded like skin splitting. I shoved my hand into the dark gap between the canvas and the backing. My fingers brushed against thick paper. I pulled it out. It was a heavy manila envelope, sealed with red wax. Right at that exact second, a jagged flash of lightning tore across the dark sky outside the living room window. The Oregon storm was finally hitting the coast. Thunder rattled the glass panes. I broke the wax seal with my thumb. I dumped the contents onto the glass table. 3 items slid out. The first was a thick stack of legal papers. Last will and testament of Henry Webb. The original document. The one Walter claimed never existed. The second item was a black and white photograph. I picked it up. The glossy surface felt cold. It was a picture of a young man wearing a United States Navy uniform. He was standing on the deck of a ship. It was Walter, my father. He looked arrogant, his chest puffed out. But it was not his face that made my heart stop. It was the massive blood-red stamp hammered diagonally across the photograph. The ink was old, but the letters were burned into the paper with absolute authority. A WOL, absent without official leave, desertion. A cold, heavy wave of absolute disgust washed over my skin. My stomach turned. In the military, there are cowards and there are traitors. Desertion is the lowest, most pathetic crime a person wearing the uniform can commit. You leave your brothers behind. You turn your back on the line. It is a stain that never washes off. For 14 years, this man stood on my front porch, reeking of cheap beer, screaming in my face about respect. He pointed his fat, shaking finger at my chest and called me a disgrace. He told me I did not know what loyalty meant. He was a deserter, a fraud, a parasite wearing the mask of a hard-working American man. I dropped the photograph onto the table like it was infected. I reached for the third item. It was a small piece of folded yellow notepad paper. I opened it. The handwriting was shaky, written with a heavy hand. My grandfather's handwriting. I read the words slowly. I took the fall for you. I stood in front of the commanding officer and took the blame for your cowardice because you were my blood. I accepted the shame so you would not spend 10 years in a federal military prison for walking off your post on the USS Hanley. I forgave you, but you will never wear the uniform again. And hear me now. If you ever lay a hand on my granddaughter or try to take what I am leaving her, these papers go straight to the federal authorities. Do not touch her. My jaw locked tight. The muscles in my neck strained until they ached. My grandfather, a man of absolute honor, ruined his own perfect service record to save a coward. He died with that black mark on his name. He gave up his pride to give Walter a second chance. And how did Walter repay him? He stomped a muddy boot across the old man's face, sued his own daughter, and tried to steal the house. The landline phone on the kitchen wall rang. The shrill noise cut through the thunder. I walked into the kitchen. I did not rush. I picked up the receiver and held it to my ear. I did not say a word. Listen to me, you ungrateful little brat. Walter's voice barked through the plastic speaker. He sounded out of breath. I could hear the wet, heavy sound of him chewing on a cheap cigar. Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock, my lawyer's office downtown. You are going to sign the quitclaim deed and hand over the property. I stared through the doorway at the red AWOL stamp sitting on the glass table. We are done playing games. Walter growled, his voice dripping with fake authority. You signed the house over to me and your mother. You do that, and I will be generous. I will leave you enough cash in your bank account to buy a one-way plane ticket back to whatever desert you crawled out of. You do not sign, I will have the judge freeze your accounts and leave you with nothing. Are we clear? He was trying to corner me. He thought he was dealing with the scared little girl he threw out of the house 14 years ago. He did not realize he was talking to a ghost. He did not realize I was already holding the nuclear launch keys. I took a slow, deep breath. 4 seconds in. I will be there, I said. My voice was completely flat. Dead. You better be, and dress like a civilian. Do not wear those stupid medals. You are embarrassing the family. He hung up. The line hissed with static. I placed the receiver gently back on the wall hook. I walked back into the living room. I gathered the original will, the photograph, and my grandfather's note. I slid them back into the thick manila envelope. I walked down the hall to the steel gun safe. I opened the heavy door, tossed the envelope onto the top shelf, right next to my spare ammunition, and slammed the steel door shut. I spun the combination dial. Tomorrow at 10 o'clock, Walter wanted to have a legal meeting about the family legacy. I was going to give him a firing squad. 10 o'clock. The attorney's office was downtown. It smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and the bitter rot of stale coffee sitting in a styrofoam cup. The central air conditioning blasted cold air, making the room feel like a meat locker. I sat at one side of the heavy mahogany table. My black Pelican briefcase rested by my boots. Across from me sat Walter and Elise. Their lawyer, a guy in a cheap blue suit with too much hair gel, sat beside them shuffling papers. Walter leaned forward. He was trying to take up space, trying to look big. He slid a thin stack of papers across the polished wood. They were home-printed receipts, hardware store slips for nails paint, and cheap lumber. "Look at this," Walter barked. He tapped a thick, calloused finger against the top page. 14 years. You threw this family away for 14 years to go play G.I. Joe. I am the one who kept that house from falling apart. I fixed the roof. I paid the bills. You do not have the right to demand anything from us, Alicia. The house goes into our name, or we take you to court for abandonment. I did not flinch. I did not lean forward to match his aggression. I leaned back into the leather chair. In the military, when you take fire, you do not immediately start shooting blind. You assess the target. I locked my eyes on Walter. He was breathing too fast. The heavy gold ring on his right hand was tapping an irritating rhythmic beat against the mahogany table. Thwack, thwack, thwack! But the most telling detail was the thin layer of greasy sweat forming right at his hairline. He was not angry. He was terrified. He needed this house. He was desperate for it. I kept my breathing steady. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out. The silence in the room stretched out heavy and suffocating. The lawyer cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with my lack of reaction. That is when Elise decided to deploy her weapon. She leaned across the table. Her eyes were red, welling up with tears, right on cue. She reached out, trying to grab my hand. I pulled my arm back, resting it on the armrest. Her hand grabbed empty air. "Alicia? Honey, please," Elise whimpered. Her voice trembled. It was the exact same tone she used when she needed Walter to cover a bad credit card debt. "Just sign the paper. Your father and I are drowning. We are absolutely broke. Material things do not matter. They are just wood and dirt. You have your military pension now. You are set for life. Are you really going to put your own parents out on the street over a stupid piece of paper, weaponized guilt?" It was textbook gaslighting. She was trying to make me the villain for defending the very thing my grandfather had left to me. She wanted me to believe that my 14 years of taking incoming mortar fire was somehow less stressful than her sitting in a living room, maxing out credit cards. I looked at the lawyer. He was staring down at his legal pad, pretending not to notice the emotional blackmail. "Are we done?" I asked. My voice was flat, cold. Walter slammed his fist on the table. The gold ring cracked against the wood. "Do not give me that attitude. You owe us." I reached down. I snapped the 2 heavy latches on the Pelican case. The mechanical clicks cut through his shouting. I pulled out a thick-bound stack of papers, 3 inches thick. Every page carried the official blue stamp of the Navy Federal Credit Union. I did not slide them. I slammed the entire stack onto the center of the mahogany table. The heavy thud made Elise jump in her seat. "Look at the pages, Walter," I said. The lawyer reached for them first. He flipped the cover page. His eyes widened behind his wire-rimmed glasses. He quickly scanned the next page, then the next. "What is this?" Walter demanded, grabbing a page from the lawyer. "That is $150,000, I said, leaning forward for the first time. I kept my voice low, making sure every syllable hit him like a physical strike. That is my hazard pay. 14 years of automatic wire transfers, straight into the county tax assessor's office and the home repair escrow account. Walter's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The greasy sweat on his forehead began to drip down the side of his face. You did not fix the roof, I did. You did not save the house, I did. Every single nail holding that structure together was paid for with money I earned, bleeding in the dirt while you sat in a bar drinking cheap beer. Elise let out a sharp gasp. Alicia, how dare you speak to your father like... Shut up, Elise, I cut her off. I did not raise my voice, but the absolute lack of respect in my tone shut her mouth instantly. I stood up. I buttoned the front of my jacket. I looked down at the two people who had thrown me out like garbage 14 years ago. They looked small, pathetic. I never abandoned the house, I said, grabbing the handle of my empty briefcase. I just refuse to keep feeding a pair of parasites. If you want to take me to court, file the papers. But next time we sit down, I am not bringing bank statements. I turned my back on them and walked toward the heavy glass door. We will bury you, Walter screamed, his voice cracking with panic. You think you are so smart, you do not know what is coming for you. I pushed the door open. I did not look back. I knew exactly what was coming. I just needed to know how desperate he was willing to get before I dropped the anvil on his head. The winter storm hit the Oregon coast just after midnight, ripping through Astoria with absolute violence. The wind howled off the Pacific Ocean, slamming heavy freezing sheets of rain against the wooden siding of the house. Inside, the darkness was heavy. I sat in the living room chair, watching the shadows stretch across the wall. The only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. Then the frantic pounding started. Fists hammered aggressively against the heavy oak front door. The wood shuddered under the impact. At my feet, Finn stood up immediately. The thick hair on the back of his neck raised into a rigid line. A low guttural growl rumbled deep inside his chest, vibrating against my boots. I signaled him with one sharp hand gesture to stay. I walked slowly across the room, the floorboards cold beneath my feet, and pulled back the deadbolt. The wind ripped the door out of my hand with brute force. Elise stood on the porch. She was soaking wet. Her expensive beige trench coat, the one she usually wore to impress her friends at the country club, was plastered to her skin like a dirty rag. Her hair hung in flat, stringy clumps across her face. She pushed past me without an invitation, stumbling blindly into the hallway. Her expensive leather shoes were completely waterlogged. They made a sickening, squishy sound on the hardwood floor. Freezing rainwater dripped from her coat, pooling into a dark, muddy puddle around her feet. She was shivering violently, her chest heaving with panicked, ragged breaths. I grabbed the heavy door, threw my shoulder against the wind, and forced it shut. The deadbolt clicked back into place. The sudden quiet inside the house felt suffocating. I did not go to the linen closet. I did not fetch a warm towel for her. I did not ask if she was freezing. I stopped exactly 6 feet away from her and crossed my arms. I maintained a safe, tactical distance. The air between us felt thick with absolute disgust. She reached into the deep pocket of her wet coat with trembling hands. She pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. It was soaked through, the black ink running down the page like dirty tears. She threw it onto the entry table. It was a photocopy. A very bad off-center photocopy of my grandfather's last will and testament. The exact same document Walter claimed did not exist. Your father is being blackmailed, Elise gasped. Her voice cracked. It was pathetic, hollow, and completely devoid of pride. I looked at the wet paper. I did not flinch. My heart rate stayed perfectly level. Go on. Somebody found out, she sobbed aggressively, wiping the freezing rainwater off her pale face. Somebody got their hands on Walter's old military file, the real one from 1989. They know about the ship. They know he deserted his post. They sent a letter to his construction office 2 weeks ago with a copy of the red stamp. She took a shaky step toward me. I held up my right hand. A hard, physical stop. She froze in her tracks. How much? I asked. My voice was dead flat. $300,000. She choked out, her shoulders shaking. Cash. In small, unmarked bills. They said if Walter does not pay the hush money by the end of the month, they are going to mail the desertion file to the federal authorities and the local news outlets. He will go to federal prison, Alicia. He will lose the business. We will lose everything. The pieces finally snapped together in my mind with perfect clarity. The sudden, aggressive lawsuit. The desperate attempt to strip my name off the property deed. They did not just want to steal the house because they were greedy. They needed an asset to liquidate immediately. They wanted to sell the only home I had ever known to pay off a faceless blackmailer. They were entirely willing to throw their own daughter out onto the street to cover up Walter's cowardice. "Sign the quit-claim deed," Elise begged. She dropped to her knees right there on the wet floorboards, her hands clasped together. "Please, I am begging you as your mother. We can sell the property to a cash buyer this week. You have a military pension. You are young. You are strong. You can survive on your own. But your father cannot survive a federal prison block. Save your family." I stared down at the pathetic woman kneeling in the puddle of dirty rainwater. On the battlefield in the Middle East, I threw my own body armor over my squad mates to take incoming shrapnel for them. I bled for them. I trusted them with my life, and they trusted me with theirs. That was loyalty. Here in my own hometown, my biological mother was actively asking me to act as a human financial shield for a criminal. I stepped around her kneeling body. I grabbed the brass handle of the front door and pulled it wide open. The freezing Oregon wind roared back into the hallway, biting at my skin. "Get up," I ordered. Elise looked up, her red puffy eyes wide with absolute shock. "Alicia, you cannot do this. Whoever commits the crime pays the price," I said, my voice cutting through the sound of the storm. "I do not protect deserters. Get out of my house." She scrambled to her feet, her waterlogged shoes slipping dangerously on the wet wood. She opened her mouth to scream, to hurl another wave of guilt at me, but the absolute dead cold in my eyes stopped her. She realized I was not playing a game. She staggered backward out the door and into the freezing, violent rain. I slammed the heavy door shut and threw the deadbolt. I locked her out in the storm where she belonged. Betrayal from your own blood is always the sharpest, most ruthless blade. If you have ever had a family member stab you in the back just to save themselves, hit the like button right now. Subscribe to the channel and drop a comment below saying, "I understand." Because sometimes we just need to know we are not fighting this family war alone. The house was dead quiet again. Just the sound of the heavy rain beating against the front glass. Then the landline phone on the kitchen wall rang. I walked into the dark kitchen and picked up the heavy plastic receiver. It was well past midnight. "Webb," I answered. "Commander Webb." A deep, gravelly voice spoke through the static on the line. It was a voice I had not heard since a bloody firefight in Yemen 5 years ago. It belonged to the man who had sat on the judge's bench yesterday morning, Judge Crane. I said, my grip tightening on the phone. "I saw your face in my courtroom and I pulled the old military archives." The old general said, his tone heavy with a dark, suffocating dread. "It is time you knew the absolute truth about the USS Hanley." 6 o'clock in the morning. The commercial fishing pier in Astoria was completely dead. The winter storm had passed, leaving behind a thick, freezing gray fog that rolled off the Columbia River. The air tasted heavy, salt, rusted iron, and rotting fish. A black Chevrolet Suburban pulled off the gravel road and rolled slowly onto the wooden dock. The massive tires crushed broken clamshells into white powder. The engine cut off. The driver's side door opened with a heavy metallic groan. Judge William Crane stepped out. He was not wearing his black judicial robes today. He wore a faded olive green field jacket, the same kind he wore when he commanded my unit in Yemen. He was 70 years old, built like a brick wall, with eyes the color of cold steel. He walked up to me. The heavy wooden planks of the pier creaked under his boots. He did not extend his hand for a handshake. Veterans with combat scars rarely do. We stood shoulder to shoulder, looking out at the freezing, choppy water. Crane pulled a half-smoked cigar from his pocket, bit the end off, and spit it into the gray water below. He lit it. The bitter, acrid smell of burning tobacco cut through the salty air. He reached inside his jacket and pulled out a thick file. It was sealed inside a clear plastic sleeve. He slapped it hard against my chest. I caught it. The plastic was freezing cold. Right across the center of the manila folder, stamped in harsh black ink, were 2 words. Top secret. I pulled strings that I'm not supposed to pull to get that out of the Federal Registry, Crane said. His voice was gravelly grinding like gears stripped of oil. I recognized your face in my courtroom yesterday. I recognized the name Webb. I made some calls to the Pentagon last night. I looked down at the file. My thumb traced the edge of the plastic. The USS Hanley. 1989, Crane said. He took a slow drag of his cigar. A brutal Pacific squall, worse than the storm we had last night. Walter was a petty officer on deck duty. When the massive waves hit the port side, the safety lines snapped. Crane paused. He did not look at me. He kept his eyes locked on the gray horizon. A kid named Miller went over the rail. He was holding onto the steel mesh. He screamed for help. Walter was standing 10 feet away. He had the emergency tether. All he had to do was clip it to the rail and grab the kid. My chest tightened. The cold anger from yesterday solidified into something heavy and absolute. I already knew the ending. Walter dropped the tether. Crane growled, his voice thick with absolute disgust. He panicked. He threw his weapon down, turned his back on the rail, and ran inside the bulkhead to save his own skin. He locked the watertight hatch behind him. Miller washed away. They never found the body. Leaving a man behind. In the military, there is no sin greater than that. You do not leave a brother in the water. When the storm broke, the commanding officer put Walter in handcuffs. Crane continued. He was facing 20 years in Leavenworth for desertion and dereliction of duty. But your grandfather, Henry Webb, was a highly decorated Master Chief. He had leverage. He took the fall. He signed a confession stating he had given Walter a direct order to abandon the deck. Henry took a dishonorable discharge and ruined his own legacy just to keep his coward of a son out of a federal cell. My grandfather, the man who taught me how to shoot, how to stand up straight, how to be a soldier, he died with a disgraced military record so the parasite could live a comfortable life. And now that same parasite was suing me to steal the house Henry built. Open the folder, Crane commanded. I pulled the flap back. The first document was a formal Navy incident report. The second was a sworn affidavit. The signature on that confession is a forgery, Crane said. He turned his head and looked me dead in the eyes. Henry did not sign it. Walter forged his father's name to save himself. It took the Pentagon investigators 30 years to flag the handwriting discrepancy, but it is flagged now. The blackmailer threatening Walter likely stole this file from a breached database. I slid the papers back into the cold plastic. You walk into my courtroom tomorrow at 10 o'clock, Crane said. His voice was low and lethal. You hand that file to the bailiff. I will immediately strike down Walter's civil lawsuit. Then I will sign a federal warrant to have him arrested for perjury and desertion. He will lose his business. He will lose his freedom. He will die in a military prison. Crane dropped his cigar onto the wet wood and crushed it under the heavy heel of his boot. The gun is loaded, Commander. The trigger is yours to pull. Crane turned around, walked back to the black Suburban, and drove away. The heavy tires threw gravel into the fog. I stood alone on the pier. The freezing wind ripped through my hair. I looked down at the top-secret file in my hand. I could hand it to the judge tomorrow. I could watch the federal marshals slap steel cuffs on Walter's wrists. It would be easy. It would be clean. But it was too good for him. Prison is a physical cage. Walter was a narcissist who thrived on playing the victim. If he went to prison, he would just cry to anyone who would listen about how his evil daughter framed him. He would still think he was the hero of his own pathetic story. I unzipped my field jacket and shoved the heavy plastic file inside, pressing it flat against my ribs. I was not going to send Walter to prison. I was going to do something much worse. I was going to shatter his entire reality. I was going to make him live the rest of his miserable life, knowing he was completely powerless against the daughter he threw away. I turned my back to the ocean and started walking toward my truck. Walter was probably drinking himself into a panic right now, terrified of the blackmailer. I was going to let him bring the fight to my front door. And then I was going to execute him without firing a single shot. The sun was dropping fast over the tree line. The sky turned a bruised, ugly purple. I was standing in the kitchen wiping down the Oak Island counter when I heard the engine roar. A heavy Ford pickup truck tore down the street, jumped the concrete curb, and plowed straight across my front lawn. The heavy mud tires ripped deep, ugly trenches into the grass before the truck slammed on the brakes. The smell of burning rubber drifted through the open window. The driver's side door flew open. Walter stumbled out. He did not bother walking up the path. He stomped right through the flower beds, tracking mud onto the porch. He hit the front door with a heavy fist. He did not knock. He hammered. I unlocked the deadbolt and stepped back. He shoved the door open so hard the brass knob punched a hole right through the drywall. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving under a cheap flannel shirt. His face was flushed deep red and sweating. The sharp, toxic smell of cheap whiskey rolled off him in waves. "You saw him!" Walter barked, pointing a thick, shaking finger at my chest. He stumbled forward, almost losing his balance on the hardwood floor. "Elise saw the black SUV leave town this morning." "You met with Crane." "What did he give you? Give it to me right now." He lunged toward the kitchen island, his eyes wild and desperate. I did not step back. I reached down to my belt. My hand closed around the textured grip of my tactical knife. I drew the blade fast. The black steel flashed in the dim kitchen light. I drove the knife straight down. The 3-inch blade buried itself deep into the solid oak countertop. Whack! The heavy, violent sound stopped him dead in his tracks. He froze, staring at the knife vibrating in the wood just inches from his hand. I did not draw the weapon to threaten him. I drew it to establish a physical boundary. He crossed this line, he dealt with the consequences. I stood perfectly still, shoulders squared, back straight. I looked at the pathetic, sweating man in front of me. "I know everything," I said. My voice was lower than is completely empty of emotion. "I know about the storm in 1989. I know about the USS Hanley. I know you dropped the tether." Walter's mouth fell open. The aggressive red flush in his face drained away, leaving behind a sickly pale gray. He looked like a man who had just been shot in the gut and was waiting for the pain to hit. "I know exactly what my grandfather sacrificed to keep you out of a federal cell." I continued, twisting the knife slightly. The wood groaned around the steel. "He took the fall. He ruined his own name so you could keep yours. And you paid him back by stepping on his grave." Walter shattered. The narcissistic rage exploded. He grabbed an empty glass water pitcher off the counter and hurled it full force at the kitchen wall. It shattered into 100 pieces, showering the floor with sharp glass. "I hate it," he screamed. The thick veins in his neck bulged against his skin. Spittle flew from his lips. "I hate your stupid uniform. I hate every single medal you ever pinned to your chest. Every time you walked into a room wearing that navy suit, everybody looked at you like you were some kind of god. But all I saw was Henry. Every time I looked at you, I saw Henry standing right there, judging me, looking down on me." He was practically hyperventilating, drowning in his own toxic jealousy. He hated my success because it reminded him of his own failure. He hated my courage because it exposed his cowardice. He hated me because I was everything he pretended to be. He slumped against the kitchen counter, burying his face in his hands. The whiskey on his breath stank up the whole room. "Just do it," he sobbed, his voice cracking into a pathetic whine. "Call the federal marshals, call the police, hand over the file, shoot me right now. Put a bullet in my head and get it over with." He wanted me to execute him so he could die a victim. He wanted to go out thinking he was a martyr crushed by a cruel daughter. I reached down and grabbed the handle of the knife. With one sharp yank, I pulled it free from the oak. I ran my thumb down the flat edge of the black blade, wiping off the wood dust. I looked at him. I did not feel pity. I did not feel anger. I felt absolutely nothing. "No," I said quietly. Walter looked up, his bloodshot eyes wide with confusion. I slid the knife smoothly back into the Kydex sheath on my belt. "I am not going to call the cops. I am not going to shoot you." I leaned in closer. "Tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, we are going to walk into that courtroom. And I am going to teach you how a real soldier defends their honor." I jerked my chin toward the open front door. "Get out of my house." 10 o'clock. The Clatsop County Courthouse was dead quiet. The harsh, cold fluorescent lights hummed above the heavy oak tables. Unlike the scene my father had caused yesterday in my kitchen today, there was no shouting. There was no broken glass. I did not wear my Navy uniform. I did not need medals pinned to my chest to prove I had honor. Honor is in the bone. I wore a crisp white button-down civilian shirt and dark slacks. My back was perfectly straight. My hands rested flat on the defense table. Across the aisle, Walter sat next to his cheap lawyer. He looked physically sick. His face was the color of old cement. His thick fingers gripped the edge of the wooden table so hard his knuckles were completely white. Every time he exhaled, the breath rattled in his throat like dry leaves. He knew exactly what was inside the thick manila envelope sitting right under my left hand. He was waiting for the executioner to drop the blade. Up on the bench, Judge William Crane adjusted his glasses. He looked down at the paperwork in front of him, then shifted his cold steel-gray eyes over to Walter. Plaintiffs Walter and Elise Webb are petitioning this court to strip the defendant of all legal inheritance rights to the property located on Shoreline Drive, citing abandonment, Crane stated. His gravelly voice echoed off the wood-paneled walls. He turned his head slowly and locked eyes with me. He gave a fraction of a nod. The signal. Does the defense wish to submit any new evidence that might alter the outcome of this civil proceeding? Crane asked. The entire courtroom seemed to suck in a breath and hold it. Walter squeezed his eyes shut, his shoulders hunched up around his ears. He was bracing for the impact. He was waiting for me to pull out the top-secret file, slide the AWOL stamp across the table, and watch the federal marshals step forward with the steel cuffs. He was waiting for his business, his freedom, and his fake reputation to be burned to the ground in public. I looked at the heavy manila envelope under my hand. I ran my thumb along the rough paper edge. Inside was the loaded gun, the nuclear option. I looked across the aisle at Walter. He was a coward. He had always been a coward. If I handed that file to the judge, Walter would go to Leavenworth. He would sit in a cell and spend the next 10 years telling the other inmates a fabricated story about how his cruel, ungrateful daughter framed him. He would play the victim. He would never take real responsibility because his narcissistic ego would not allow it. Prison was a physical punishment. It was too clean. It was too easy. I did not want him in a cell. I wanted him to rot inside his own mind. I slid my hand off the envelope. I pushed it 2 inches to the left, away from the center of the table. No, Your Honor, I said. My voice was calm, steady. There is no new evidence, because some dirty truths deserve to stay buried forever. Walter's eyes snapped open. He stared at me, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. He could not process what was happening. He expected me to execute him. Instead, I had just locked my weapon away. Judge Crane stared at me for a long, heavy moment. He understood exactly what I was doing. He saw the psychological kill shot. Crane picked up the heavy wooden gavel. In light of the financial records previously submitted during mediation, which clearly proved the defendant's ongoing financial support of the estate, this court finds the claim of abandonment entirely baseless. Crane announced. He raised the gavel. Petition denied. Case dismissed. Smack. The sharp crack of the wood hitting the sounding block echoed through the room like a rifle shot. It was over. The house was mine. The ambush had failed. I did not smile. I did not look at Elise, who was quietly sobbing into a tissue. I picked up the sealed envelope, turned on my heel, and walked straight down the center aisle. My boots hit the tile floor with a steady, measured rhythm. I pushed through the heavy double doors into the courthouse hallway. Alicia? Wait! The voice was ragged, pathetic. I stopped, but I did not turn around. I heard the scuff of Walter's heavy work boots on the floor behind me. He had chased me out of the courtroom. You had it, Walter whispered. His voice was shaking uncontrollably. You had the Navy file. You could have sent me away. You could have ruined me. He swallowed hard. You did not have to spare me. I turned my head slowly. I looked over my shoulder. My eyes locked onto his. There was no anger left in me. There was only the absolute freezing void of a predator looking at a broken animal. I did not spare you, Walter, I said. My voice was soft, but it cut through the hallway like a razor blade. If I put you in a cell, you would just convince yourself you were a martyr. I am not giving you that out. I turned fully to face him. He looked small, shrunken. You hate my uniform. You hate everything I stand for. But from this day until the day you die, every time you look in the mirror, you are going to know exactly why you are not wearing handcuffs. I took one step closer. The smell of fear was practically rolling off his skin. You are going to have to live every single day with the absolute fact that you were saved by the daughter you despise, the daughter you threw away. You owe your pathetic freedom to my honor. I held his gaze until he physically flinched and looked down at the floor. That is your life sentence, I said. I turned my back on him and walked out the glass doors, leaving him entirely alone in the long, cold hallway. Late afternoon. The sky over Astoria was a flat slate gray. I stood on the wooden dock behind my house, pulling the heavy nylon mooring line tight. The bitter wind off the Columbia River whipped against my canvas jacket. The damp, freezing mist coated the dock in a thin layer of slippery grime. I wrapped the thick rope around the rusted iron cleat, finishing the knot with a sharp, downward pull. The sound of boots dragging across the wood broke the silence. I stood up. I did not turn around immediately. I listened to the uneven, heavy steps moving closer. The old timber creaked under the weight. I turned my head. Walter was walking down the pier. He was alone. No cheap lawyer, no crying wife to use as a shield. He wore an old Carhartt jacket that looked too big for him now. His shoulders were slumped forward, completely devoid of the aggressive, chest-puffed arrogance he carried into the courtroom yesterday. In 24 hours, the man looked like he had aged 20 years. His face was hollow, gray. He stopped exactly 3 feet away from me. He did not try to step into my personal space. The boundary had been established. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the cold water slapping against the barnacle-covered pilings under our boots. Walter reached into the deep front pocket of his work jacket. His hand was trembling. He pulled out a heavy object and held it out in his palm. It was my grandfather's vintage United States Navy compass. The thick silver casing was heavily tarnished, blackened by years of neglect. He looked down at the compass, then up at me. His eyes were bloodshot. "I never deserved to hold this," Walter said. His voice was a harsh, broken rasp. It sounded like he had been swallowing sand. "Henry gave it to me the day I shipped out. He told me it would always bring me home if I stayed true to the course." He swallowed hard. A single thick tear broke free and tracked through the deep wrinkles on his face. "I did not stay true," he choked out. "I dropped the line. I ran. I spent my whole life running from that deck. And I hated you. Because you did not." The confession hung in the freezing air. 14 years ago, I would have begged for this validation. I would have cried. I would have hugged him and told him everything was going to be okay. But I was not that girl anymore. I was a veteran who had survived real crossfire. I did not need his validation to know my own worth. His admission of guilt did not erase the fact that he tried to destroy me just 3 days ago. I looked at his shaking hand. "You held your course," Walter whispered, pushing his hand slightly closer to me. "You earned it. Take it. Please." I did not smile. I did not offer him a warm look of forgiveness. I reached out and took the compass from his palm. The silver metal was freezing. The heavy glass face was cold against my calloused fingers. I flipped the lid open with my thumb. The needle inside wavered for a second, then snapped firmly toward true north. I snapped the lid shut. The metallic click was sharp and final. I slid the heavy silver compass into the breast pocket of my canvas jacket right over my heart. The transfer of the legacy was complete. The ghost of Henry Webb was finally back where it belonged. I looked back at Walter. He was staring at me, his eyes full of a pathetic, desperate hope. He was waiting for absolution. He was waiting for me to tell him I would fix the blackmail situation for him. He wanted me to save him one last time. I zipped my jacket up to the collar. "The blackmailer is your problem, Walter," I said. My voice was perfectly calm, flat. "You created the debt. You pay it. Do not ever come back to this house." Walter flinched as if I had struck him across the face. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The last shred of his ego died right there on the wooden pier. I turned my back on him. I walked away, my boots hitting the wet dock with a steady, unbreakable rhythm, leaving him standing alone in the freezing fog. 1 month later. The heavy steel hammer struck the nail head with a sharp, ringing crack. I drove the galvanized steel flush into the raw oak floorboard. The basement smelled of fresh pine, sawdust, damp concrete, and old motor oil. I wiped the back of my wrist across my forehead, clearing the sweat from my eyes. I grabbed another 2-inch nail from the leather pouch hanging off my belt, positioned the sharp tip against the wood, struck it. Crack. The hole Walter had ripped open with a crowbar 30 days ago was permanently sealed. I spent the last 4 weeks systematically erasing every piece of damage. I replaced the shattered glass in the back window. I patched and painted the drywall in the hallway. I even paid a local crew in cash to lay down thick, new asphalt shingles on the roof before the next winter storm hit. Every physical scar left by my family's greed was gone. I wiped the dirt off my calloused hands with a greasy shop rag. The perimeter was secure. The house was mine. Upstairs, the floorboards creaked as Finn paced the living room. He let out a single low bark. Not a threat alert. Just a notification that something was approaching the property line. I hooked my hammer into my tool belt and climbed the wooden stairs to the ground floor. Through the front window, I saw the familiar Ford pickup truck idling by the curb. The engine cut off with a heavy mechanical clatter. Walter and Elise stepped out onto the asphalt. They walked slowly up the concrete path. They did not march aggressively across the front lawn like last time. They did not hammer their fists against the wood. They stopped exactly at the edge of the front steps. Elise was holding a heavy white ceramic pot with both hands. I unlocked the deadbolt, pulled the front door open, and stepped out onto the porch. The late afternoon Oregon sun cast a pale, cold, golden light across the wooden planks. The biting coastal wind carried the rich, heavy smell of melted butter, boiled potatoes, and ocean salt. Clam chowder. We brought some dinner," Walter said. His voice was low, rough around the edges. He kept his thick hands shoved deep into the pockets of his faded Carhartt jacket. They did not step up onto the porch. They did not reach for the door handle. They did not assume they were invited inside. The psychological boundary was absolute. They were standing on the outside of the fortress, waiting for permission to even speak. I looked at the ceramic pot in Elise's trembling hands, then shifted my gaze to Walter. His face was weathered, tired, and stripped of all its former arrogance. "Put it on the porch table," I said. My voice was flat, a simple command. Elise nodded quickly, almost too eagerly. She shuffled forward, set the heavy pot down on the weathered wood of the patio table, and stepped backward instantly. She kept her distance. I turned my attention away from them, looking at the wooden pillar framing the front steps. I picked up a cast iron bracket and a heavy DeWalt power drill from the porch railing. I aligned the black metal straight over the old stripped screw holes. Walter stepped forward. He did not ask for permission. He just reached out, placing his thick, calloused hand against the iron bracket to hold it steady against the timber. I did not push him away. I did not thank him. I raised the drill and squeezed the trigger. The motor whined loudly as I drove the 3-inch lag screws deep into the solid wood. The heavy United States Navy flag, folded into a tight, perfect triangle on the railing, was waiting to be hung. Walter let go of the bracket. He dropped his hand back to his side. He looked down at his worn leather boots, then up at the folded canvas. "You make us proud," Walter muttered. The words sounded forced, awkward in his mouth, like he was learning to speak a completely foreign language. I picked up the folded canvas. I did not smile. I did not offer him a warm embrace or a tearful reunion. "Takes going through the fire to finally appreciate the quiet," I said. I snapped the brass grommets onto the metal hooks. The dark blue fabric unfurled, catching the strong coastal wind. The flag snapped sharply in the cold air. They did not linger. They understood the new rules of engagement. Walter gave a short, stiff nod, turned around, and led Elise back down the concrete path to the truck. I stood on the porch and watched the Ford pull away, the red taillights disappearing into the fading gray daylight. Night fell over Astoria. The sky turned pitch black, dotted with cold, distant stars. I sat alone on the top step of the porch. Finn lay beside me, his heavy head resting across my leather boots. I ran my hand slowly through his thick, coarse fur. The neighborhood was dead quiet. No shouting, no broken glass, no threats. I reached into the breast pocket of my canvas jacket. I pulled out the heavy silver compass Walter had given me on the docks. My thumb pressed the side latch. The metal lid popped open with a clean metallic click. The glass face was freezing in the night air. The magnetic needle wavered for a fraction of a second before locking into place. True north. The war was over. There were no shots fired, no casualties left bleeding in the dirt. Just a quiet, permanent line drawn in the sand that no one would ever cross again. Forgiveness is not a sign of weakness. It is the tactical maneuver a soldier uses to walk away from the minefield of the past without getting blown up. If you have ever had to build a hard boundary to protect yourself from toxic family members, hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below and tell me exactly how you built your wall. Your resilience might be the compass that saves someone else's life today.